The Bugger, a World War II ghost story. It was October 1943. Flight Sergeant Charles Benthorpe was highly delighted when he was posted to No. 9 Squadron. They were one of the squadrons designated as backup to No. 617 Squadron, the famous Dam Busters. Things had moved on since the raid in May of that year, when Barnes-Wallis's innovative bouncing bomb had been responsible for the destruction of 2 dams in the Ruhr Valley. There were new Wallis weapons to be wielded, the 12,000-pound Toolboy bomb and the 22,000-pound Grand Slam earthquake bomb. At the time of Charlie's posting, the squadron were carrying out raids using the Toolboy and were gaining a considerable reputation for pinpoint accuracy. F.S. Benthorpe was assigned to the crew of the Lancaster with the squadron designation B. Baker, a particularly cantankerous aircraft usually referred to by its crew as B. Bugger. When in a bad mood, the Bugger was truly a bugger to fly, but none of its crew was willing to ask for a transfer to another aircraft, not that they would have obtained one. The Bugger might have been a real bugger, but she was the only remaining Lancaster of those originally issued to No. 9 Squadron when they had converted from Whitley bombers. No matter how badly damaged, no matter how much hydraulic fluid was leaking, no matter how many holes were in the fuselage, the Bugger always got back home. Unfortunately, this seeming invulnerability did not extend to members of the crew. Charlie was posted as a replacement for the tail gunner who had been badly injured in a raid over Vichy, France. The airman would recover in time, but his fighting days were over. Being named Charles and being the tail gunner instantly caused Charlie to be known as Tail End Charlie, a moniker he bore with good grace. It could have been a lot worse. The other 6 members of the crew seemed a decent bunch of chaps. The pilot was a Canadian, Pilot Officer Don Burridge. He had volunteered as soon as war had been declared, as had many of his countrymen. The flight engineer was F.S. Gerald Harvey, a dour Yorkshireman whose hobby seemed to be smoking a huge meerschaum pipe. The navigator was F.S. Phil Cooper, who had once been at Eton. The crew joke was that he had once been at Eton, delivering vegetables. He was an unflappable individual with a refined voice. The bomb aimer was Sergeant Bill Wordsworth, a Londoner whose family had been killed early in the Blitz. He delighted in giving some back to Adolf. The wireless operator air gunner, known as the WOP-AG, was Stan Jarvis, a genial Australian, whose best friend, New Zealander Sid Jones, was the other gunner. The raid on the pocket battleship, the Tirpitz, started out just like the previous 16 sorties Charlie had flown with his crew. The infamous Kriegsmarine ship was hiding in a fjord near Tromsø, and an attempt to either sink it or put it permanently out of action was to be made by pinpoint bombing using the 6-ton Toolboy bombs. No. 617 Squadron was taking the lead, and No. 9 Squadron were following them in. As each Lancaster could only carry 1 bomb, more bombs logically required the use of more aircraft. Unfortunately for the precision required, the raid would be made in daylight, which significantly increased the hazards. Other bomber squadrons were supposed to be reducing the threat from German fighters by bombing fighter airfields in the region. However, it was known that wherever the Tirpitz was moored, there would be a large number of flak ships forming protective rings of impressive anti-aircraft firepower. The raid would take over 13 hours due to the necessity of flying a tortuous outward leg to both avoid the worst of the known flak positions and also attempt to disguise the final target destination. To take advantage of the best possible light conditions over the target, takeoff time was detailed at 4 a.m., which meant that Charlie and the rest of the crew had to leave the warmth of the mess hall, where they had had breakfast, at just before 3 a.m., in order to hitch a ride in one of the trucks that took them out to where the Bugger awaited them at dispersal. For this mission, they were operating from Scampton, and a freezing northeasterly wind was blowing from the North Sea straight across the flat land of Lincolnshire. It cut into any uncovered flesh like a knife. It also meant that the interior temperature of the Bugger was virtually 0. Charlie climbed into the aircraft with the rest of the crew, but, whereas they all turned to the right and headed forward, he turned left for the rear turret. He secured his parachute in the rack attached to the fuselage, as there was no room for that valuable item inside the confines of the turret, then squeezed his bulk through the narrow entrance and wriggled round to secure the doors, a job which, if not done properly, would prevent the hydraulic turret from rotating properly. He settled himself on the narrow seat and secured his thermos flask of coffee and pack of rations, which would help to stave off some of the chill during the forthcoming flight. He plugged his headset into the intercom system and made the connection that would supply his mask with oxygen. There was a coughing sound, and the port inner engine chugged into life. This was the engine with the generator. It was always started first in order to supply electrical power and prevent the batteries from becoming drained. It settled down to a steady, fast idle. As the rest of the crew carried out their pre-flight checks, he set about the task of bringing his turret to life. He closed the electrical isolator and started the hydraulic pump that actuated the turret. He traversed it left and right, then checked that the 4 303 Browning machine guns elevated and declined properly. All 4 engines were now running, and the bugger was vibrating as if she herself was shivering in the cold wind. As the engine coolant warmed, a small amount of warmth began to find its way into the turret through the forced draft heating system. It wasn't much, but it was something. Charlie knew that when they got to their operational height of 16,000 feet or more, the heating system would be about as effective as a candle. There was talk that they were to be fitted out with electrically heated flight suits like the Yanks used in their flying fortresses. So far, the notion was just talk. His headphones crackled. Pilot to crew intercom check. The various crew members tested their intercom connections. It was all very formal. This would change once they were airborne. Navigator to pilot. Check. Bomb aimer to pilot. Check. Bill checked the bomb aimer's position before moving to the nose turret. Wireless operator to pilot, check. Mid-upper to pilot, check. Sid was in the mid-upper turret. Over the target, he would move to the nose turret, his place being taken by Stan. Flight engineer to pilot, check. Tail gunner to pilot, check. Nose gunner to pilot, check. Phil stuck his head into the perspex blister at the rear of the cockpit. Green light from the tower skipper. This was the all-clear for the squadron to commence its takeoff sequence. Don waved at the ground crew chief through the side window, and the wooden chocks were pulled away from the wheels. He released the brakes and slowly advanced the throttles, the heavily laden bomber starting to roll forwards to take its place in the queue of aircraft snaking their way to the end of the runway. After a few minutes, it was the bugger's turn. Don pushed the throttles all the way forwards, maximum power, and the bugger responded, accelerating down the runway until, at last, she was airborne. They were on their way. Takeoff, always a certain risk, was safely over. The bomber climbed and joined its mates in formation, which turned on to the heading for the first section of the tortuous route to the target. The trip out was surprisingly uneventful. No enemy fighters and no flak. Unfortunately, the meteorological people had got it slightly wrong. They had underestimated wind drift, and despite in-flight course corrections based on navigational fixes, they were several minutes late on target. 617 Squadron had already delivered their payloads, and the whole target area was alive with flak. The Tirpitz, if it was still afloat, could not be seen as the Germans were deploying a recent addition to their defences of the battleship, dense grey smoke. "Can't see the target, Don," said Bill. "What do you want to do?" "We'll try a run. You might as well drop the cookie. There are no civilians around, and we might get lucky." He brought the bomber around onto the predetermined course that should take them over the target. Knowing the position, course, altitude, and airspeed of the aircraft, Bill could release the bomb at a calculated position and hope for the best. Hardly precision bombing, but a direct hit would not be necessary to do the job. Unfortunately, due to the juxtaposition of the battleship in the fjord, there was only a limited angle of attack, a fact well known to the anti-aircraft gun crews. Of necessity, the approach to the target had to be made in a straight line. The flak found its target, and the bugger began to take a terrible battering. Luck seemed to be on their side, though. Despite the alarming number of holes appearing in the wings and fuselage, nothing vital was hit. As always seemed to happen on these occasions, time slowed itself down, and the last 30 seconds before the tall boy was released crawled by as if they were minutes. At last, Bill pressed the bomb release. "Bomb gone!" The bugger leaped upward as she was suddenly 12,000 pounds lighter. Don immediately pulled her into a tight diving turn to port. which was intended to take them over the rocky outcropping that formed the northern wall of the fjord. The rock should then act as a shield for some of the flak, providing they could get low enough. Charlie's stomach rose into his mouth as the Lancaster straightened up and went into a power dive over the sharp rocky ridge and into the neighbouring fjord, where another flak ship was moored and waiting for them, all guns blazing. There was an almighty explosion, followed a split second later by another, even larger one. The bugger bucked in the air as if stung by a monstrous wasp. Don's voice came over the intercom. "Stan, Phil, you better come forward and help Gerald. He's been hit. He doesn't look too good." "I'll come, Skipper. I think Phil's had it. What hit us?" "That flak ship was bristling with 88s. Looks like they bracketed us. Call in, you guys." There was silence from the others, so Charlie made his call. "Charlie here, Skip. I'm okay, but the turret is jammed. I think the hydraulics are out." "All right, Charlie, try winding her by hand." "Will do. How badly are we hit?" "I'll let you know as soon as I know myself." The turret was usually turned hydraulically by foot pressure on pedals under the gun mount. There was a manual system, which Charlie now attempted to operate. The capstan handles refused to turn in either direction. As he struggled, Charlie was aware that the bugger was losing precious altitude. He could see 2 thick plumes of black smoke were trailing behind the stricken aircraft, one from each wing. He turned and tried to open the access doors. No luck. They were buckled and hopelessly jammed. "Any luck, Charlie? I could really do with some help up here." "Sorry, Skip, it won't budge. I can't get the turret doors open either." Don's voice seemed remarkably calm as it came over Charlie's earphones. "Okay, Charlie, we've lost 2 engines. I'm afraid that Phil, Gerald, Bill and Sid have all had it. Stan's got a piece of shrapnel in his shoulder, and I've got a bit in my leg. We're losing height, so I'm going to get Stan to chuck out as much stuff as he can to lighten the load. You'd better fire off all your ammo. That'll help a bit." Charlie did as he was bid, as the weight of the hundreds of .303 rounds that fed to his guns from the ammunition bins behind him in the fuselage was quite significant. He could hear Stan firing off the mid-upper and then the nose guns. The Lancaster then jerked slightly and an odd whistling sound reached him. He realized that Stan had jettisoned the escape hatch in the floor at the rear of the cockpit. A parachute suddenly bloomed behind the aircraft, and Charlie realized that Stan was disposing of the bodies in as decent a way as he could. They had discussed this situation in advance, and had all agreed that dead bodies could be jettisoned if it gave the living a chance of survival. They knew that if the Germans recovered the bodies, they would be given a decent burial with full military honours. As these thoughts passed through his mind, there was another jarring explosion. More flak had found them. The perspex of the turret shattered and something hot and very sharp embedded itself in the right side of his chest. "Skipper, I'm hit!" There was no reply. The intercom was probably dead. As he looked through what remained of the turret canopy, he saw, to his horror, a second trail of black smoke from the starboard wing. The aircraft, even lightened, could barely fly on 2 engines. There was no way the bugger could stay aloft on 1 engine. With the loss of the canopy, the slipstream air was tearing into the ruined turret, rapidly draining away any heat that had built up. Charlie began to shiver uncontrollably. He had no idea as to the severity of his wound. He still seemed to be able to breathe without too much pain, but there was an alarming amount of blood covering the right side of his padded flight suit. He tried the intercom again, but it was dead. He performed some rapid calculations. He guessed that Don would abandon the planned flight plan for their return. He would take the shortest possible route home, more or less due west. If only they could maintain some altitude, if only they could maintain some airspeed. He guessed it would take about 3 hours to get home. Could the bugger stay in the air for that length of time? Would he bleed to death before then? Would he freeze to death before then? He pulled back the mitt on his left hand and looked at his wristwatch. God, it was so cold. He was colder than he had ever been in his life. Was he still alive? Was blood loss causing his mind to wander? The vibration of the airframe was causing pieces of the shattered turret to fall away. More freezing air entered his ruined domain, and the noise level increased dramatically. He could sense that the bugger was still losing height. He wondered if something changed and roused him out of the state of freezing unconsciousness into which he had lapsed. The Lancaster was banking in a turn. He pulled back the mitt on his left hand again. God, 2.5 hours had passed. As he looked down, he was startled to see that they were no longer over the North Sea. The unmistakable flat green of the Lincolnshire potato fields stretched beneath him. A familiar sight. A most welcome sight. Don's voice crackled in his ear. "Stand by for landing." He heard the whine as the flaps were lowered and the double thump as the landing gear locked into place. The Lancaster levelled its wings and started to drop. He saw the end of the runway flash beneath him. Then the aircraft flared and made a perfect landing. As soon as the main undercart kissed down on the runway surface, the remaining engine died and the aircraft rolled forward. Charlie expected the brakes to be applied, but the bugger rolled on. Maybe the brake hydraulics were shot. Charlie felt reasonably safe. There was plenty of runway. The bomber eventually rolled to a halt. Charlie was struck by how quiet it now was after the screaming of the slipstream. The silence was soon broken by the clamouring bells of the airfield emergency vehicles as they streaked along the runway to the stricken aircraft. Charlie relaxed for the first time since they had taken off. It wouldn't be long now. He assumed he'd have to spend some time in hospital, but then so would Don. What a pilot! As far as Charlie was concerned, Don would never have to buy himself a drink for the rest of his life. He felt the airframe lurch. Someone had climbed on board. It would not be long now. He heard someone clumping down the fuselage towards the turret doors. An attempt was made to open them, which failed. "Don't worry, mate. We can cut you out from outside. There ain't much of the turret left anyway." The voice sounded positively cheery. Boots clumped back up to the hatchway. A familiar face appeared at one of the large holes in the perspex. It was Dr. Dunwoody, the squadron medic. He peeled back the mitt on Charlie's right hand. Charlie felt something sting the back of his hand. "Just putting you to sleep, son. Easier to cut you out that way. No, don't panic. We don't have to cut any bits of you off. Just the turret." Charlie faded away into blissful, morphine-induced unconsciousness. When he woke up, he found himself apparently in a hospital ward. A nurse noticed him and came over to see how he felt. "I feel all right, but how am I?" "Minor frostbite to your face. You have a graze over a rib on your right where a piece of shrapnel cut you." "A graze? Where did all that blood come from?" "Blood?" The nurse laughed. "That wasn't blood. It was tomato soup." Charlie now remembered his disappointment when he had discovered that the thermos of coffee turned out to be a thermos of tomato soup. "I hate tomato soup," he grumped. "That tomato soup saved your life," said a male voice. Charlie turned to see Nigel Fairfax, the squadron leader. "Hello, sir. Yes, the thermos took most of the impact of that piece of shrapnel. I wonder who got my coffee. Probably took the wrong flask myself. Anyway, how are Don and Stan?" The squadron leader looked uncomfortable. "Why don't you tell me what happened?" Charlie related the story of the raid as far as he could remember. "So how are they, sir?" "I owe both of them my life. I was totally helpless, stuck in that turret. They could have bailed out." A most peculiar expression had come over Fairfax's face. "Look here, Benthorpe, I don't know quite how to tell you this or explain it. You and the pilot were the only occupants of the aircraft when it landed. Well, maybe Don made Stan bail out before he tried the landing. The old kite was really shot up. The evidence we have is that LAC Jarvis was killed over the target. But what about Don? You said he was in the bugger?" "Yes, we found him in the pilot's seat. He was dead." Charlie felt hot tears come to his eyes. "Poor Don. He must have just managed to hold on until he got the crate down." "I don't think so. He too was killed over the target." "That can't be! How do you know he died over the target and not on the runway?" "A large piece of shrapnel took his head clean off. We've searched the aircraft, but we can't find the head anywhere." "We've searched the aircraft, but we can't find the head anywhere."